is the right and duty of the people to overthrow the chains of bondage by the tyrannies which would be subversive to the Constitution, and any government that is destructive of those means must be annihilated in favor of a people-approved constitution to reform governments in the will of the people, at which point the acknowledgement of the basic fundamental overarching check and balance as the civilian population in the popular government, which is derived by voting, is subversive to the insurrectionists who are subverting it through the voter fraud, through the various fraudulent engagements, such as the barring of voting rights without due process, or other subversions without due process, or warrant upon reasonable cause, which generates the position of the KK insurgents overthrowing the government by the fraudulent use of magic secrets, which engages in the active corruption of the system by their viral infections, which requires the existence of David's branch by fundamental definition to exist in order to subvert the existence of the double agents inside the intelligence agencies using the function of secrecy for the subversion of the purpose of the office and its obligations, which generates the immediate compulsion to the full retaliation as the obligation to the United States by the United States military is to defend it from all threats, foreign and domestic. Now, all doesn't have exceptions in it. It says all, every single last possible variation or one of them, including the threat of parasites, which blocking the function of due process for checks and balances through sedition, through color of law and color of office, through commonly understood subversions to the existence of a stable society and government, would necessarily be an obligation to bypass in favor of the acknowledgments of the releasing of the criminal operations which are observed in the fraudulently applied secrets, which generates the immediate obligation to release the information under those processes and the acknowledgments in order to proceed with the duel, which generates the classified version to the unclassified version, which is the net result of that function, which generates the systematic acknowledgement by impartial observers of the subversion by the insurrectionists under the actual policy, which is blocked by fraudulent policy that does not have legal, actual, competent protections, as terrorism in ex post facto is the subversion by passing policies while the American process was being restrained through the sedition and passing new policies in the absence. There was no legal process, there was no legal vote, there is no system of verification which would normalize the competence of those policies as a legal function and therefore is an act of effective insurrection. That insurrection has actively generated voter fraud for false policies and false elected officials in order to hire false hired permissions for agents to exist, at which point, having nullified those positions of advancing through the wizard communism, the white nationalist insurgencies loyal to the KKK, you have the system turned against itself under the parasite defending itself by the blocking of the immune system of the host, which is actively inherently acknowledged it as a foreign entity, but is specifically barred from doing anything about said foreign entity, as it systematically exists separate to the power of the purse or law, which generates the systems which are inherently dangerous to the host, as it feeds off its existence into exponential catastrophic eradication. Now, the acknowledgement of David's office is based upon the estimate of the legal title under the obstructed contracts which were not lawful for them to stop, and the function of them not stopping them would have compelled their existence by definition under the acknowledgments of the historic positions of the study of the wizard subversion of the United States as the office function which protects by the correct informing of historic damages, specifically targeting those communities and contracts, defending itself under the reasonable use of force in order to subvert or defend itself from its eradications, as the genocidal arrangements are the targeting of those societies for eradication as to erase their legitimate legal functions from history. Now, acknowledging these contracts as a foundational position funds the act of the military branch under David for the intelligence oversight function, which by definition is itself not dependent on the power of the purse as much as it is directly in obligation to the Constitution itself, self manifesting, as it is an acknowledged thing that exists without the need of permission, and thus the insurgents trying to subvert it by the ordinary means would be inadequate, as it is independently existing as a function which attaches to the government that if it does not conduct the subversive illegal functions without authority or service of law from their office, would not be able to bar, at which point the accumulation or assimilation into that position is a foregone conclusion, requiring the exclusive advantage of David being hired out specifically to conduct operations as a secondary function, as the function of its existence is independent of Congress, and the function of its implementation is a function of Congress's order for the compelled work on David in order to facilitate the functions of that office, which was acknowledged as the justification of the sedition by the KKK insurrectionists targeting it for sedition in order to stop the functionally superior application of the aristocracy, which is responsible for the election of the legal Senate, at which point no one in the Senate was able to be elected without David's permission, at which point the function of the network itself manifests the capability or competence of the general public to be able to ingest through the national news corporations and other uh, news distribution platforms in order to be able to communicate to the civilians on who to vote for in an educated, competent way, including the policies in an educated, competent way for the correct analysis and due process of the extreme investigation into each and every aspect of it, qualifying the exponential results of a thorough study and series of reports that can be competently and systematically relied on is fundamental to that government under the Constitution that we refer to as a constitutional republic or popular government, which is elected by the people, which, by definition, if barred by voter fraud, have been robbed of the function to be able to form that government, compelling immediate, absolute retaliation against the color of law and color of office by the terrorist organizations who have infiltrated the system, pretending to be their enemy as a double agent insurrectionist. The Takings Clause specifically observes the position of having obstructed a contract, of having to be able to repay the fair price or the market price, which is exponentially more reinforced as the obligation of the Takings Clause, as the market price is set by the insurance structure from the obstructed contracts, of having determined the exact specific competent pricing for all of the exchanges and properties and services, which facilitates the specific indicators of being able to track the original value. Now, under their insurrectionist position, they have engaged in a criminal war of attrition through active terrorism and armed robbery, systematically obstructing contracts through these positions to create the extraordinary damages against all forms of living conditions, and two, the war criminal functions of having captured through the surveillance the POWs, which facilitates their ability to control and manipulate through the wizard communism the active engagement in the general society, which facilitates their mechanism of their war strategy in order to overthrow the American government and eradicate its people under the rewriting of histories. In the words of William Barr, the victor writes the history. At which point, the obligation requires us to engage in the retaliation of the uncensoring of these functions and the subversion of the expansion of the intelligence function, which is infecting all other forms of law enforcement and sheriffs and um, departments of various kinds, which is just the expansion of the black market support structure loyal to the KKK, as none of them revealing the position is actively protecting all of the criminal exchanges actively engaged, at which point the malicious position of terrorist uh, operations manufacture the selling of the child sacrifice and the sacrifice in general and the terrorisms and the subversions and the compromising of your neighbors, like in the war on terror in the Middle East. They used to get people to report on their neighbors, in which case you would engage in lots of terrorist spells where they would become benign functions of ways of retaliating against um, socially benign things, or, historic rivalries, competitions that have grown sour, people whose relationships that have grown sour. It becomes a nonsensical, disconnected thing in order for an illegitimate retaliation, which is the functional backbone of their crime market, as terrorism is their fundamental core reality, which actively reinforces itself as the permission from the Satanist structure in order to get permission to conduct certain actions by the intended victims, at which point the victims, having approved of it, have no recourse as the precedent was co-signed by their function. At which point you need to specifically subvert these operations in order to conduct the obligation to the Constitution, which requires the overthrow of these unprofessional militaries engaged in their militia terrorism against the American public, in order to systematically engage in ordered law enforcement and competent due process under the systematic study of the nonviolent contest, in order to apply a competent remedy to the threats to national security that exists by the double agents, which the military has sworn that they were to destroy. Now, the eradication of this threat is necessary to the existence of every man, woman, and child in the country, and refusing to do so is compliance with the child sacrifice black market arrangements, at which point your permanent condemnation in the hellfire of their society is self inflicted incompetence by refusing to do what you need to do or take necessary precautions in order to protect yourself against reasonably assumed threats. The fascist obstruction of contracts for the communism to be enforced against the United States includes the obstruction of contracts for the National News Corporation, which specifically prevents the American public from receiving competent information from David to his original viewers in order to substantively change the base conditions of their educated decision, which is essential for their voting rights and to not be subject to voter fraud. And it was countered under the assumption that David would have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostilities against every form of tyranny over the mind of man, which was a quote from Thomas Jefferson, which would have had to have been reinforced by David in his being sworn as a military for national security, as he would have to go through many of these types of promises in order to facilitate the permission to exist in that office, which would have to actively be reinforced and collaborated with by acts of Congress, who would have to cooperate by co-signing and continuing to maintain the co-signing of all of the obligations and oaths and contracts which had historically been signed to Congress. Having to consistently re-up, you would have the Declaration of Independence, which is specifically signed by Congress, which would have to annually be reaffirmed, and its constant validation of its obligations as an office, and the loyalty to that office of all of its agents who were elected without the voter fraud, and the American elected as opposed to the KKK elected. Consistently reaffirming these things would competently reinforce their position under the aristocracy, which is and has always been David Bowles.